The ballroom air was a cloying confection of beeswax, wilted roses, and the unspilled perfume of 100 hopeful debutantes. For Lady Elara Vance, it was the scent of her own slow suffocation. She stood near a marble pillar, the cold stone a welcome anchor in the swirling sea of silk and saccharine smiles. Her dress, a modest grey silk meticulously mended by her own hand, was an island of solemnity in an ocean of pastel frivolity. It was her 3rd season, and the novelty of being a wallflower had long since curdled into a quiet, aching humiliation. She was not beautiful. This was a fact she had accepted with the same stoic resignation she applied to darning her father's socks or watering down the soup. Her features were pleasant enough, she supposed, eyes the colour of a stormy sea, a mouth that was perhaps too wide, and a fall of unremarkable brown hair that refused to hold a curl. But in a world that prized dazzling blondes and rose-petal complexions, pleasant was tantamount to invisible. Worse than invisible, it was an invitation for casual cruelty. "Look, it's the little grey mouse," a voice whispered, sharp and saccharine as poisoned honey. Lady Beatrice Finch, Elara's own cousin, glided past with her entourage of sycophants, her peacock blue gown a deliberate, vibrant insult. Beatrice, with her golden ringlets and porcelain skin, was everything Elara was not. One would think she'd have the decency to remain at home. It is simply pitiful to see her haunt these affairs, hoping for a miracle. A ripple of cruel laughter followed. Elara's fingers tightened on the smooth, cool fabric of her reticule. She did not look up. She had learned long ago that meeting their eyes only sharpened their sport. Instead, she fixed her gaze on a portrait of a long-dead ancestor on the far wall, his painted eyes seeming to hold a measure of sympathy for her plight. He at least did not judge her for the fraying hem of her gown or the worry that had etched fine lines around her father's eyes. The Vance fortune, once respectable, had dwindled to little more than a title and a heavily mortgaged estate. This ball, this entire season, was a final, desperate gamble. A suitable match for her was the only thing that stood between her family and utter ruin. But suitable matches were not made with grey mice. They were made with prized mares, with pedigrees and purses to match. Her focus drifted from the portrait to the hushed, excited whispers rippling through a nearby cluster of dowagers. Their fans fluttered like agitated birds, their words darting out in sharp, conspiratorial bursts. They were not speaking of her, for once. Their attention was captured by a far more compelling subject. "Hasn't been seen in London for 5 years, not since the tragedy. They say the north wing of Blackwood Manor is kept exactly as she left it, a veritable shrine, or a tomb," another added, with a theatrical shiver. "The man is made of ice and shadow. They call him the Winter Duke for a reason, the Duke of Blackwood, Alistair St. Vincent." The name itself seemed to cast a chill. A man of immense wealth and power, a recluse, haunted by the ghost of his beautiful, tragic first wife, who had perished in a fall from the cliffs near their estate. He was a creature of Gothic legend, a dark prince in a fairy tale gone wrong. The women spoke his name with a mixture of fear and a morbid, irresistible fascination. He was the ultimate prize, yet entirely unattainable, locked away in his grief. Elara felt a strange, detached pity for this man she had never met. A heart frozen by sorrow was a cage she could understand, in her own small way. Her own heart was not frozen, but it was certainly well guarded, shielded against the constant, small cuts of a society that found her lacking. The evening wore on, a monotonous parade of forced smiles and ignored curtsies. Elara danced the requisite quadrille with a pimply young baron whose hands were clammy and whose conversation consisted solely of his passion for fox hunting. When it was over, she retreated back to her pillar, the familiar solitude, a comfort. It was here that her father found her, his face ashen, his usual stooped posture more pronounced than ever. "Elara," he said, his voice a low, strained whisper, "we must leave." A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. "Is something wrong, father?" He avoided her gaze, his eyes darting around the opulent room as if the walls themselves were closing in. "It is worse than I told you. The creditors, they will not wait any longer. We are ruined, my dear. Utterly." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She had known they were in difficulty, but she had not grasped the sheer, terrifying immediacy of the threat. The visions were stark and cruel, their beloved, crumbling home seized, their few loyal servants dismissed, her father, with his weak heart, cast out into the world with nothing. "What are we to do?" she breathed, the words barely audible over the swell of the orchestra. Her father finally met her eyes, and what she saw there broke her heart. It was a look of profound defeat, of a man stripped of his last vestiges of pride. "There is one possibility, a last resort. It is not what I would have ever wished for you, Elara. It is a grim prospect. Anything, father. I will do anything." The words were a vow, spoken from the very core of her being. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I have been in correspondence with the solicitors of the Duke of Blackwood." Elara stared at him, uncomprehending. The Winter Duke, the man of ice and shadow. "But why? How?" "He requires a new duchess," her father said, the words flat and devoid of any romantic connotation. "He has a child, a daughter. He needs a mother for her, a chatelaine for his estate. It is not a proposal of the heart. It is a business arrangement." His solicitors were most clear on that point. They were seeking a lady of good breeding and quiet disposition, one who would not bring disruption to his household. Quiet disposition, a polite term for a woman no one else wanted. A woman who would be grateful for any offer, no matter how cold. The cruelty of it was a physical blow, yet beneath the pain, a strange, steely resolve began to form. This was not a fairy tale. This was survival. "He is willing to settle all our debts," her father continued, his voice heavy with shame, "and provide a generous settlement for my own care, in exchange for you." He said her name as if it were a curse, but Elara heard it as a solution, a grim one certainly, but a solution nonetheless. She could be the pillar her father leaned on, just as she had been leaning on the cold marble of the ballroom. She could be the foundation that saved their name from ruin. "When do I meet him?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. The music of the ball, the laughter, the whispers, it all faded into a distant hum. Her world had narrowed to this single, terrifying point. Her father looked at her, his eyes welling with tears. "His Grace does not attend social functions. The meeting is arranged for tomorrow morning, at his solicitor's office in Lincoln's Inn Fields." An office, not a drawing room, not a garden. A place of contracts and cold, hard ink. It was fitting. She was to be bartered, a quiet commodity to be exchanged for coin and security. She lifted her chin, her spine straightening. Let them call her a grey mouse. This mouse was about to walk into the lion's den to save her family. and she would not flinch. The offices of Messrs. Gable and Croft were as grey and unyielding as Ilara's prospects. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and the dust of 1,000 settled disputes. A severe-looking clerk had shown her into a small, wood-panelled room, furnished with 2 stiff-backed chairs and a large mahogany desk. A single window looked out onto a rain-slicked London street, the sky the colour of lead. It was a room designed for transactions, not introductions. She sat, her hands folded primly in her lap, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had not slept. The night had been a long torment of what-ifs, of imagining the man who was to be her jailer, her saviour, her husband. The whispers from the ball echoed in her mind. Ice and shadow, the winter duke. The door opened without a sound, and he was there. The whispers had not done him justice. He was not a man, he was a presence, a force of nature that seemed to suck the very air and warmth from the room. Tall and broad-shouldered, he was dressed in immaculate, severe black, the only relief a stark white cravat at his throat. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, and his face. It was a masterpiece of unforgiving angles and harsh beauty. A strong jaw, a straight nose, mouth that looked as if it had never known how to smile. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the colour of a frozen lake, pale, clear, and utterly devoid of warmth. They assessed her in a single, sweeping glance that was neither appreciative nor dismissive. It was the look of a man appraising livestock. He did not greet her. He moved to the other side of the desk, his movements economical and precise, and remained standing, looming over her. Ilara forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to be cowed. She rose from her chair and offered a small, respectful curtsy. "Your Grace," she murmured. "Lady Ilara," he responded, his voice a low baritone, as cold and resonant as a funeral bell. He did not invite her to sit. He did not sit himself. The interview, it seemed, had already begun. "My solicitors have outlined the situation to your father," he began, his tone clipped and devoid of any emotion. "Let me be perfectly clear, so there are no feminine misunderstandings later on. This is a contract." He paused, his piercing eyes boring into hers, daring her to protest or show any sign of sentimentality. She remained silent, her expression serene, though her insides were churning. "I require a duchess for Blackwood. My estate requires a mistress. My daughter requires a governess with a title. You will fulfill these roles. You will manage the household accounts, oversee the staff, and provide a stable, quiet presence for my daughter, Rosaline. Your duties will be clearly defined." He spoke of his child as if she were another line item in a ledger, a stable, quiet presence. He was hiring a functionary, not choosing a wife. "In return," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "I will settle the entirety of the Vance debt. A sum will be transferred to your father's name that will see him live out his days in comfort. You will have a generous allowance, and you will want for nothing in a material sense. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace," Ilara said, her voice a shade above a whisper, but unwavering. He seemed momentarily surprised by her lack of protest, by the quiet dignity in her acceptance. A flicker of something. Was it curiosity? Respect passed through his frozen eyes before being extinguished. "There is one further matter," he said, the coldness in his tone intensifying. "The matter of an heir. The Blackwood title requires a male heir. I will expect you to perform your wifely duties in that regard." But let us be clear. It will be a duty. Nothing more. Once you have produced a son, I will not trouble your bed again. The clinical cruelty of his words struck her like a physical blow. He spoke of the most intimate act between a man and a woman as a distasteful chore to be completed and then forgotten. She felt a hot flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks, but she pushed it down, burying it deep. She had made her choice. She had to see it, or through. And what of affection, Your Grace? The question slipped out before she could stop it, a small, foolish spark of defiance. His lips thinned into a hard, unforgiving line. You will not have it. Not from me. My heart is not part of this arrangement. It is buried, Lady Alara, and I have no intention of exhuming it. You will have my name, my protection, and my fortune. You will not have my confidence, my friendship, or my love. You are to be my Duchess, not my companion. If you require sentiment, you must look elsewhere. Do you accept these terms? This was it. The precipice. She could refuse, could walk out of this cold grey room and return to a life of genteel poverty, watching her father fade away with worry. Or she could step off the edge into a life of gilded misery, a loveless marriage to a man whose heart was a block of ice. But in that gilded cage, her father would be safe. Their name would be preserved. And his daughter, a little girl who needed a mother. Perhaps there, in that small duty, she could find a sliver of purpose, a flicker of warmth. She looked directly into his cold, beautiful, broken eyes. I accept your terms, Your Grace. For the first time, a genuine though fleeting expression crossed his face. It was not warmth, but a grudging respect. He had expected tears, hysterics, pleading. He had not expected this quiet, unbreakable strength. He gave a single, sharp nod. Very well. The wedding will be in 2 weeks. A private ceremony at the chapel at Blackwood. My solicitor will handle all the arrangements. A carriage will be sent for you. Be ready. And with that, he turned and left the room, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. He had not offered her his hand. He had not smiled. He had not said a single word more than was absolutely necessary. Elara sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The rain beat a mournful tattoo against the window pane. She was to be the Duchess of Blackwood. She had saved her family, and she had just condemned herself to a lifetime of winter. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a passage from one world to another. The rolling green hills and tidy villages of the south gradually gave way to a wilder, more rugged landscape. The sky grew heavier, the clouds hanging low and grey over wind-swept moors and ancient, gnarled trees that seemed to claw at the sky. It was as if the land itself was reflecting the temperament of its master. The carriage turned onto a long, private drive, flanked by a high stone wall covered in ivy. Through the gates, Elara had her first glimpse of her new home. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a fortress of grey stone, a Gothic behemoth of turrets, gables, and countless mullioned windows that stared out like vacant eyes. It rose from the landscape with a brooding, formidable presence, seeming less built upon the land than grown from it, a natural extension of its rocky, unforgiving terrain. A sense of profound isolation washed over her. This was not a place of warmth or welcome. It was a place of secrets and sorrow. As the carriage crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, the heavy oak doors swung open. A line of servants stood assembled in the grand entrance hall, their faces impassive, their postures rigid. At their head was a stern, grey-haired woman, in a black bombazine dress, who introduced herself as Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper. Her welcome was correct, but as cold as the marble floor beneath Ilara's feet. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood," Mrs. Davies announced to the staff, her voice echoing in the cavernous two-story hall. The servants offered a synchronized, shallow bow. There were no smiles, no murmurs of welcome. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and wary deference. She was an intruder in their world of long-established grief. The Duke was not there to greet her. "His Grace is in his study. He does not wish to be disturbed," Mrs. Davies stated, as if anticipating the question. "I will show you to your chambers." Her chambers, not their chambers. The distinction was stark and immediate. She was led up a sweeping, uncarpeted stone staircase, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence of the house. The air was cold, carrying the faint, musty scent of disuse and something else, something like old, dried flowers and lingering sadness. They passed a long, dark corridor. "The north wing, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It is closed." Ilara understood. This was the shrine, the tomb of the first Duchess. It was a physical manifestation of the part of her husband's heart that was forever barred to her. Her own rooms were in the east wing, overlooking a vast, rolling lawn that ended abruptly at the edge of a forbidding line of cliffs. The sea, a churning expanse of grey, was visible in the distance. The rooms were spacious and handsomely furnished, but they felt impersonal, like the guest quarters of a grand but cheerless hotel. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill that seemed to seep from the very stones of the manor. It was here, as her maid Martha unpacked her few belongings, that she finally met the child who was to be her charge. A small girl stood hesitantly in the doorway, clutching the hand of a severe-looking governess. This must be Rosalind. She was a miniature version of her father, with the same raven-black hair and a delicate, elfin face. But where his eyes were ice, hers were wide, dark pools of bewilderment and fear. She was a ghost in her own home, a tiny, silent creature lost in the vastness of the house and its sorrow. "Lady Rosalind," the governess said stiffly, "come and greet the Duchess." Rosalind shrank back, her small hand tightening its grip. She did not look at Ilara, her gaze fixed on a point on the floor, somewhere to the left of Ilara's feet. Ilara's heart went out to the child. She knew what it was to feel small and invisible. She dismissed the governess with a quiet word and knelt down, bringing herself to Rosalind's level. She did not try to touch her. She simply waited. "Hello, Rosalind," she said softly. "My name is Ilara. It is a pleasure to meet you." The little girl said nothing. She remained as still as a frightened fawn, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. Ilara could see the faint tremor in her small body. This child was not just quiet. She was terrified. The days that followed settled into a cold, predictable rhythm. Life at Blackwood was governed by the clock and the Duke's impenetrable moods. Breakfast was a solitary affair for Ilara and Rosalind, the latter of whom still refused to speak to her. Luncheon was the same. Dinner was the only meal she took with her husband, and it was an exercise in silent torture. They would sit at opposite ends of a long, polished dining table, the vast expanse between them a physical representation of their emotional distance. The Duke would eat with a focused, grim intensity, his eyes never meeting hers. He would speak only to issue an order to a footman or to make a terse, impersonal inquiry about the estate. Did the ledgers from the tenant farms arrive? Has the steward reported on the repairs to the east wall? He never asked about her day. He never asked about his daughter. He was a remote, brooding presence, a king in his castle of grief, and she was merely his most senior servant. She would watch him when he wasn't looking, studying the harsh lines of his face, the tension in his shoulders, the deep, abiding sorrow in his eyes when he thought no one could see. She saw the cracks in his icy facade, the raw pain he worked so hard to conceal. He was a man drowning in his own past, and he had made it clear he wanted no one to throw him a lifeline. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, mistress of a grand estate, with a title and security beyond her wildest dreams, and she had never felt more alone in her entire life. She was living in a cold truce, an enduring quiet that was more deafening than any argument. She was a ghost in a house already full of them, her only purpose to remain silent and still, so as not to disturb the carefully preserved sorrow of its master. Weeks bled into a month, each day a near-perfect replica of the last. Ilara learned the geography of the house, the names of the servants, the intricate silent dance of a household held in the grip of its master's grief. She performed her duties as Duchess with quiet efficiency, reviewing accounts, planning menus, and overseeing the endless tasks of running a great estate. The staff, led by the formidable Mrs. Davies, began to treat her with a grudging respect. She was not the flighty, demanding creature they might have feared, but a steady, serious presence. Yet, a true sense of belonging remained elusive. She was the Duchess, but she was not, and never would be, the mistress of the Duke's heart. Her attempts to connect with Rosalind were met with the same silent, fearful resistance. Ilara would spend an hour each day in the nursery, sometimes reading aloud from a book of fairy tales, her voice soft and even in the quiet room. Rosalind would sit across the room, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on her doll, never acknowledging Ilara's presence. The governess, a woman named Miss Ingram, who seemed to believe that children should be seen and not heard, did little to encourage any interaction. Yet Ilara persisted, her patience a deep, quiet well. She recognized the child's fear as a fragile shield, one that could not be broken by force, but might, with time, be gently set aside. It was during one of her solitary explorations of the manor's grounds that she found it. Tucked away behind a high, crumbling brick wall, almost completely obscured by overgrown ivy, was a heavy, iron-bound wooden door. It was unlocked. Pushing it open with a groan of rusted hinges, she stepped inside and gasped. It was a garden, or rather, the ghost of a garden. It had once been magnificent. A stone sundial, its face obscured by moss, stood at the center of what had been intersecting paths, now choked with weeds. The skeletal remains of climbing roses clung desperately to a collapsing trellis. A stone bench was half swallowed by an encroaching thicket of thorns. The entire space was a riot of neglect, a beautiful, ordered place that had been abandoned to chaos. It felt like a perfect metaphor for the house, for the family within it, a place of forgotten beauty and suffocating sorrow. She found the head gardener, an old man named Mr. Abernathy, with hands as gnarled as an oak root, tending to the severe, formal lawns at the front of the manor. When she asked him about the walled garden, his weathered face grew solemn. "Ah, that was her ladyship's garden," he said, his voice dropping respectfully. He meant the first Duchess, Isabel. Spent most of her days in there, she did. had flowers sent from all over the world. It was her sanctuary. After she passed, His Grace gave the order. No one was to set foot in it again. We were to let it go. To let it go. But they hadn't let it go. They had locked it away, preserved its decay, just as the Duke had preserved his grief. An idea, bold and perhaps foolish, took root in Ilara's mind. It was a quiet, personal act of rebellion against the suffocating stasis of Blackwood. She would not be restoring the garden for him. She would be doing it for herself, to create one small corner of life and colour in this vast grey emptiness. And perhaps for the ghost of the woman who had loved it, and for the little girl who had never known her mother. She returned to the garden the next day, armed with a pair of shears and thick leather gloves she'd found in a potting shed. She started small, clearing the weeds from around a single, resilient rose bush that still clung to life, its leaves spotted but its stem strong. It was hard, physical work, her muscles aching, her hands becoming scratched and sore. But as she worked, a sense of peace settled over her. Here, in the dirt and the thorns, she was not the Duchess, not the unwanted wife. She was just Ilara, tending to something broken, hoping to coax it back to life. She began bringing Rosaline with her. She did not ask the child to help. She simply brought a blanket and some of Rosaline's toys, setting them on a patch of grass she had cleared near the stone bench. While Ilara knelt in the soil, patiently untangling weeds from the roots of long dormant perennials, Rosaline would sit and watch, her silence as profound as ever. For days the child did not move from the blanket. Then, one afternoon, as Ilara was carefully pruning the wild suckers from the base of the lone rosebush, she felt a small presence beside her. Rosaline had left the blanket and was standing a few feet away, her dark eyes fixed on the bush. She pointed a small, hesitant finger. "Thorny," she whispered, the word a tiny, fragile puff of sound. It was the first word Rosaline had ever spoken directly to her. Ilara's heart leaped. She kept her movements slow, her voice gentle, so as not to startle the child. "Yes, very thorny," she agreed, with a soft smile. "But if you're careful, you can avoid the thorns and find the flowers. See?" She pointed to a single, tight bud of deep crimson that had formed on the bush. "Soon, this will be a beautiful rose." Rosaline took a half-step closer, her curiosity warring with her ingrained fear. From that day on, something shifted. Rosaline still did not speak much, but she would follow Ilara around the garden, watching her work. Sometimes she would hand Ilara a tool, or point out a strange insect. They were small, tentative bridges being built across a chasm of silence and sorrow. Ilara was not just clearing a garden, she was clearing a path to the heart of a lonely little girl. She knew the Duke watched her sometimes. From the window of his study, which overlooked the walled garden, she would occasionally catch a glimpse of his tall, dark figure, a silhouette against the glass. He never came down, he never said a word. But he watched. He watched her bring his daughter into the one place on earth he had condemned to ruin. And he watched as, inch by painful inch, she began to bring them both back to life. It was a silent challenge to the stasis he had imposed, an act of quiet initiative that was changing the very atmosphere of his frozen kingdom. The first true thaw came not from the sun, but from the mouth of a child. It was a Tuesday, a day like any other, grey and overcast. Ilara and Rosaline were in the garden, which was now beginning to show the faint, promising blush of restoration. Neat borders had been dug, The stone paths were clear of weeds, and dozens of small green shoots were pushing their way through the dark, rich soil Ilara had spent weeks turning and feeding. Rosalind, holding a small trowel Ilara had given her, was intently focused on a patch of earth where they had planted pansy seeds. Suddenly, she looked up at Ilara, her dark eyes wide and serious. "Mama liked flowers," she stated. It was not a question. It was a fragment of a memory, unearthed like a long-buried bulb. Ilara's heart clenched. She knelt beside the child, her own work forgotten. "Yes," she said softly. "I believe she did. This was her garden." Rosalind looked around at the slowly returning order, the promise of color. It was sad before. Now it is waking up, waking up. The simple, profound truth of it, spoken by a child who was herself just beginning to awaken from a long, sad sleep, brought tears to Ilara's eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. "We are helping it wake up," Ilara said, her voice thick with emotion. Later that evening, the dinner with her husband began with its usual oppressive silence. The cavernous dining room was lit only by a candelabra on the table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The Duke sat at the far end, a formidable silhouette against the gloom, his features etched in granite. Ilara picked at her food, her mind still on Rosalind's words. Halfway through the main course, the Duke spoke. His voice, when it came, was so unexpected that it made her start. "I saw you in the garden today, with Rosalind." It was the first time he had ever voluntarily mentioned his daughter to her. Ilara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She looked up, meeting his gaze across the long expanse of polished wood. His expression was unreadable, his pale eyes holding hers. "Yes, Your Grace. We spend most afternoons there." "She spoke to you," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. He had seen. "She did," Ilara confirmed, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She did not know if she was being praised or reprimanded. A long silence followed. Ilara could hear the ticking of the grand clock in the hall, each second a heavy, deliberate beat. She braced herself for a command to cease, to leave the garden alone, to return to the cold, sterile order he had decreed. Instead, he said, "The air in the house, it smells of damp earth and roses." The words were simple, an observation of fact, but they landed in the silent room with the force of a revelation. He was not just seeing her actions, he was noticing their effects. The scent of the living, breathing world she was cultivating was permeating the sterile, preserved air of his home. It was a change, and he was acknowledging it. He said nothing more for the rest of the meal, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The silence was no longer entirely oppressive. It was watchful. When he looked at her now, as he occasionally did from across the table, his gaze was different. The cold indifference was still there, but it was overlaid with something else, a flicker of intense, calculating curiosity. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a contractual obligation, a quiet presence, but as a person, a force of change within his carefully controlled world. The next day, a small package was delivered to her room. It was a long, slender box wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a set of finely crafted gardening tools, a trowel, a cultivator, a weeder, each with a handle of smooth, polished rosewood. There was no card. Her breath caught in her throat. It was an extravagant, impersonal, yet deeply personal gift. It was an acknowledgement, a concession, perhaps even an encouragement. It was the first glimmer of warmth from the Winter Duke, a sign that beneath the ice and snow, something might still be capable of growth. Holding the cool, smooth wood of the trowel in her hand, Ilara felt a surge of hope, so powerful it almost frightened her. It was a fragile, tender shoot, pushing its way through frozen ground, and she knew she had to protect it, to nurture it, and to pray it would not be crushed by an early frost. The fragile piece of blackwood, like the new buds in the garden, was delicate and easily threatened. The threat arrived in a lacquered carriage drawn by 4 perfectly matched white horses, a gaudy intrusion into the manor's sombre monochrome. Lady Beatrice Finch had invited herself for a visit. Her letter, filled with effusive, false sentiment about needing to see her dearest cousin Ilara so happily settled, had left no room for polite refusal. Ilara had dreaded her arrival for a week, the knot of anxiety in her stomach tightening with each passing day. Beatrice was a creature of the bright, cruel world Ilara had left behind, a world that had no place in the quiet, healing sanctuary she was slowly building. Beatrice swept into the entrance hall like a conquering general, her vibrant crimson travelling dress a slash of garish colour against the muted greys and browns of the manor. She enveloped Ilara in a cloud of expensive French perfume and a brittle, air-kiss embrace. "Ilara, my darling," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough to make the portraits on the wall seem to flinch. "You are looking, well, the country air suits your rustic constitution." The compliment was expertly backhanded, a silken glove holding a stone. Over the next few days, Beatrice was a discordant note in the quiet symphony of Blackwood. She explored the house with a proprietary air, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her tongue just as sharp. She made thinly veiled comments about the manor's gloom, the severity of the furnishings, and Ilara's simple gowns. "My dear, a duchess must set the fashion, not hide from it in shades of mourning," she'd remarked, her eyes flicking over Ilara's dove-grey morning dress. "Though I suppose, in this house, one is always in mourning for something." Her most pointed cruelty, however, was reserved for Ilara's relationship, or lack thereof, with the Duke. Beatrice made it her mission to highlight the distance between them, to poke at the raw wound of their arrangement. "His Grace is as reclusive as ever, I see," she said at luncheon, after the Duke had declined to join them. "You must be terribly lonely, Ilara, rattling around in this enormous mausoleum all by yourself, a husband in name only. How very tragic." Ilara met each barb with quiet, unruffled dignity, refusing to give Beatrice the satisfaction of a reaction. But the constant chipping away at her composure was exhausting. Beatrice's presence was a reminder of everything she was supposed to be, and wasn't: beautiful, charming, desired. The true crisis came during dinner on Beatrice's 3rd night. The Duke, to Ilara's surprise and trepidation, had chosen to join them. He was a thundercloud at the head of the table, his silence more potent and intimidating than any outburst. Beatrice, however, was undeterred. Flushed with wine and emboldened by her own perceived cleverness, she turned her attention to him. "Your Grace," she began, her voice syrupy, "I was just telling Ilara how brave she is to take on a role with such a tragic history. It must be so difficult, living in the shadow of the first Duchess. Isabel, wasn't it? I hear she was the most breathtaking beauty, so full of life." Ilara froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. No one spoke the first Duchess's name, ever. It was the ultimate taboo. The Duke did not move. Not a muscle in his face twitched, but the temperature in the room plummeted. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a sudden, dangerous energy. His eyes, fixed on Beatrice, were no longer chips of ice. They were shards of obsidian, black and lethal. Beatrice, oblivious, pressed on. Such a terrible accident, to fall from the cliffs like that. One wonders what could drive a woman of such spirit to be so careless. The snap of the Duke's wineglass stem breaking was like a pistol shot in the silent room. He had crushed it in his hand. Dark red wine, like blood, dripped between his white-knuckled fingers and onto the pristine tablecloth. He rose slowly from his chair, his full height seeming to block out the candlelight. When he spoke, his voice was terrifyingly soft, a low, deadly rumble that promised violence. "You will leave my house," he said, each word a frozen dagger. "Now." Beatrice's face went white with shock and fear. Her bravado crumbled into dust. Your Grace, I only meant—" "I know what you meant," he snarled, his control finally shattering. A mask of pure, agonized fury was laid bare. "You will be gone within the hour. If I see your face in my home again, I will not be responsible for my actions." He threw his napkin onto the table, turned on his heel, and strode from the room, leaving a stunned, terrified silence in his wake. Beatrice, trembling, scrambled to her feet, muttering apologies to no one, and fled. Elara sat alone at the long table, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never seen such raw, untamed emotion from him. It was terrifying, but it was also revealing. He had not defended his own honor. He had defended the memory of his late wife, and in doing so had defended Elara from Beatrice's venomous attack. He had expelled the poison from their home. For the first time since she had arrived, they were not just two separate entities living under the same roof. They were a united front, allied against a common enemy. He had been a storm, a tempest of rage and grief, but he had shielded her in the heart of it. Later that night, as the real storm broke outside, rattling the window panes with wind and rain, Elara lay in her bed and thought not of his anger, but of the fierce, desperate pain that lay beneath it. The shared challenge had fractured his icy control, and through the cracks she had seen the tormented, grieving man he tried so hard to hide. The storm that had driven Beatrice from Blackwood raged all night, a wild symphony of howling wind and lashing rain. It was a physical manifestation of the emotional tempest that had been unleashed at the dinner table. Elara lay awake for hours, listening to the fury of the elements, her mind replaying the Duke's shattered composure, the raw pain in his eyes. The house seemed to groan around her, as if the very stones were remembering a past sorrow. Just as she was finally drifting into an uneasy sleep, a sound pierced through the noise of the storm. A thin, terrified scream. It was Rosalind. Elara was out of bed in an instant, pulling on a dressing gown as she ran from her room. The sound led her down the corridor to the nursery, where she found the little girl sitting bolt upright in her bed, her face pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond a simple fear of the storm. Miss Ingram, the governess, was trying to soothe her, but her prim, sensible platitudes were having no effect. "Mama!" Rosalind shrieked, her small body trembling uncontrollably. "The storm! Mama's gone in the storm." Elara's blood ran cold. This was not a nightmare. This was a memory, a traumatic echo dredged up from the depths of the child's mind by the sound of the raging wind. She gently pushed past the flustered governess. "Rosaline," she said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's all right. I'm here." She reached out, not to restrain the child, but to offer a steadying presence, her hand resting gently on Rosaline's shaking shoulder. But the girl was inconsolable, lost in the horror of her own memory. The nursery door creaked open, and the Duke stood there. He was a stark, dishevelled figure, his hair uncombed, his eyes haunted. The storm in his soul was a perfect match for the one outside. He looked at his weeping, terrified daughter, and his face, for a moment, was a mask of utter devastation. He looked utterly, hopelessly lost. Seeing Elara there, her hand on his child, her presence a small island of calm in the chaos, seemed to decide something for him. The carefully constructed walls he had built around himself, already fractured by the confrontation with Beatrice, finally crumbled into dust. "Come," he said, his voice hoarse, ragged with an emotion she couldn't name. "You should know. You have a right to know the truth." He turned and walked away, not waiting to see if she would follow. Elara gave Rosalind's shoulder a final, reassuring squeeze, murmured a word of instruction to the stunned governess, and followed him. He led her not to his study, but towards the one place she had never been, the forbidden north wing. He stopped before a heavy, locked door and produced a key from his waistcoat pocket. The lock turned with a grating, unused sound. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, holding a lamp aloft. He gestured for her to enter. Elara stepped over the threshold and into the past. The air was still and cold, thick with the scent of dried lavender and dust. It was a suite of rooms, a sitting room, a dressing room, a bedroom, and everything was preserved exactly as it must have been on the day its occupant had died. A book lay open on a small table. A silken shawl was draped over the back of a chair. A silver-backed brush sat on the dressing table, a few long golden hairs still caught in its bristles. It was a shrine, a perfectly preserved moment of a life cut short, and it was unbearably sad. The Duke stood in the center of the room, the lamplight casting his face in harsh shadows. He looked like a man confessing his sins at his own graveside. "This was Isabel's," he said, his voice hollow. "I kept it this way. I thought I was honoring her. Now I see it for what it is. A prison." He walked to the window, which overlooked the cliffs and the tumultuous sea below. The rain beat against the glass like frantic, ghostly fingers. "Beatrice was right about one thing," he said, his back to her. "Isabel was full of life. She was like fire, bright and beautiful and wild. I was what I am, quiet, reserved. I thought my steadiness would anchor her. Instead, it smothered her. She hated Blackwood. She called it my stone cage." He turned to face Elara, and the agony in his eyes was so profound she felt an ache in her own chest. "There was a storm," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just like this one. 5 years ago. We argued, the worst argument we ever had. I said terrible things. I told her she was selfish, childish. She told me she felt like she was dying here, that I was killing her with my coldness. And then she ran, out of the house, into the storm, towards the cliffs. A single tear traced a path down his granite cheek. He didn't seem to notice. I went after her. I called her name. The wind was screaming. I couldn't hear anything. I saw her, standing at the edge of the cliff path. Her cloak was whipping around her in the wind. I ran towards her, but the ground was slick with rain. I slipped, By the time I got to my feet, she was gone. He choked on the last word, a dry, racking sob tearing from his throat. Rosalind was at the nursery window. She saw it all. She saw her mother disappear. The pieces clicked into place. Rosalind's silence, her terror of storms, the Duke's crushing guilt and self-imposed isolation. He didn't just believe he had failed to make his wife happy. He believed, in his heart of hearts, that his coldness, his words, had pushed her off that cliff. He had been punishing himself ever since, freezing his own heart and his home in time, a living monument to his guilt. "I am the Winter Duke," he said, the words a bitter self-indictment. "I bring a chill to everything I touch." I froze her heart, and she ran from me into the sea. He stood there, utterly broken, the powerful, feared Duke of Blackwood, stripped bare of all his defences, revealing the wounded, grieving man beneath. He had finally shared the source of his pain, the terrible secret that had haunted every stone of the manor. He had let her into the locked room of his house, and the locked room of his heart. In the suffocating stillness of the preserved room, surrounded by the ghosts of a tragic love, Alistair's confession hung in the air like dust motes in the lamplight. He stood utterly exposed, his defences dismantled, his raw 5-year-old wound laid bare. He expected condemnation, pity, perhaps even revulsion. He expected her to see him as the monster he believed himself to be. Elara did not speak. She did not offer the empty platitudes of comfort he had heard from so many others in the weeks after Isabel's death. Instead, she crossed the space between them. The gesture was simple, quiet, and profound. She reached out and laid her hand gently on his forearm. It was the first time she had ever touched him voluntarily. Her touch was not one of pity, but of pure, undiluted compassion. It was a simple anchor of human connection in his swirling sea of guilt and grief. Through the fine wool of his jacket, he could feel the warmth of her hand, a small, steady heat against the perpetual chill of his skin. He flinched, not from her touch, but from the unexpected shock of it, the jolt of simple, unearned kindness. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up into her eyes. They were the colour of a stormy sea, yes, but in the lamplight he saw not turbulence, but an incredible depth, a profound and quiet understanding. "That was a tragedy, Alistair," she said, her voice soft but firm. She used his given name for the first time, and it sounded both strange and deeply right. It was not a failing. It was a storm, in every sense of the word. You cannot command the winds, and you could not command her spirit. You loved her in the only way you knew how. He wanted to argue, to retreat back into the familiar, self-flagellating narrative of his guilt. But her words held no judgment, only a deep, resonant truth that bypassed his defenses and spoke directly to the heart he thought had long since turned to stone. "Look at this house," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "Look at your daughter. You have not been honouring Isabel's memory. You have been worshipping your own grief. You closed off this wing. You let her garden die. You silenced her name. But the parts of her that truly live on, her daughter's spirit, the beauty she created, you let those wither too, in the name of your pain." Her words were not cruel. They were incisive, the clean cut of a surgeon's blade, meant to heal, not to wound. "The love you have for Rosalind," Elara said, her eyes searching his. "It is the truest part of you. I see it every time you look at her, even when you are trying to hide it. A man with a frozen heart could not love a child so fiercely. It is there, Alistair, buried under all this ice. You are not the monster you have made yourself out to be. Her empathy, so freely given when he felt he deserved it least, was the final undoing of him. The rigid control he had maintained for 5 years shattered completely. A shudder racked his entire body. He looked at this quiet, plain woman, this arrangement he had brought into his home, and saw her for the first time. He saw the strength that had endured society's scorn, the patience that had reached his silent daughter, the compassion that was now reaching out to him across the abyss of his despair. He did not know who moved first. He was only aware of the space between them vanishing. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking the soft skin of her cheeks. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, but she did not pull away. She held his gaze, her own hands coming to rest on his chest over the frantic, painful beating of his heart. In her eyes, he did not see the feared Duke of Blackwood. He saw a man in pain, and he saw absolution. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the kiss of a husband claiming his due. It was not a kiss of passion or of practiced seduction. It was a kiss of raw, desperate gratitude. It was the kiss of a drowning man breaking the surface for his first breath of air. It was clumsy and urgent, tasting of salt and sorrow. He poured all his years of unspoken grief, of crushing guilt, of profound loneliness into that single, shattering touch. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cold, forgotten room, something had irrevocably broken. The ice had cracked. He rested his forehead against hers, the lamp on the table casting their joined shadows as one on the wall. The past was still there, a tangible presence in the room. But for the first time in 5 years, the future, a possibility he had long since abandoned, felt like it might just be possible. And it had the quiet, steady feel of the woman standing in his arms. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright and clean. The rain had washed the world anew, and the sun, a rare and welcome visitor, streamed through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The oppressive gloom that had clung to the house like a shroud had lifted, replaced by a tentative, hopeful light. The change was not just in the weather, it was in the very atmosphere of the estate. Alistair had the north wing unsealed. Under Ilara's gentle guidance, the servants, initially hesitant, began the process of airing out the rooms, polishing the furniture, and carefully packing away Isabel's belongings. It was not an erasure of her memory, but a transformation of it. The wing was no longer a tomb, a monument to what was lost, but a quiet testament to a life that had been lived. The Duke himself was a changed man. The harsh, forbidding lines of his face seemed to have softened. The perpetual storm in his eyes had cleared, leaving a sky that was still wary, but no longer constantly overcast. He began to join Ilara and Rosalind for luncheon. He did not say much at first, but his presence was different. It was no longer a brooding, distant wait at the table, but a quiet, watchful attention. He would listen as Rosalind, her voice growing stronger and more confident each day, chatted to Ilara about a ladybug she had found in the garden or a story Ilara had read to her. And sometimes a faint ghost of a smile would touch Alistair's lips. He started to appear in the walled garden. He would not work alongside Ilara, not yet. He would stand by the stone sundial, his hands clasped behind his back, and simply watch her. He watched her gentle hands coaxing life from the dormant earth. He watched her patient smile as she showed Rosalind the difference between a weed and a seedling. He saw that she was not trying to replace Isabel or her garden. She was creating something new, something that honored the past but was not enslaved by it. She was cultivating life, not just in the soil, but in the very heart of his family. One sun-drenched afternoon, Ilara was on her knees, carefully transplanting violet seedlings along the edge of a newly cleared path. Rosalind was a short distance away, happily digging in a patch of dirt of her own. Ilara was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear him approach. "It looks different." She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. Alistair was standing over her, his shadow falling across the flower bed. He was no longer dressed in his severe, formal black, but in a tweed jacket and riding boots, as if he had just come from an inspection of the estate. "It is a work in progress," she said, smiling up at him. "Like most of us, I suppose." He looked around at the burgeoning life, the splashes of purple from the violets, the deep crimson of the single perfect rose that had bloomed on the bush she had first tended, the cheerful yellow faces of the pansies Rosaline had helped plant. "For 5 years," he said, his voice low and contemplative, "I thought that grief was a promise I had to keep. I believed that by preserving everything exactly as it was, by freezing my own heart, I was being loyal to Isabel's memory." He knelt down on one knee beside her, an act of profound equality that made her heart skip a beat. He reached out and touched the petal of the crimson rose, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You have shown me how wrong I was. Loyalty isn't found in stasis. Life, it insists on moving forward. You did not come here and tear down the old walls. You simply opened a door and let the sun in." He turned his gaze from the flower to her face. His eyes, the color of a winter lake, now held the warmth of the afternoon sun. "I have been living in a self-made prison, Ilara. And you, with your quiet strength, your boundless compassion, you have handed me the key. I know our marriage began as a contract, a cold and cruel bargain for which I am deeply ashamed." He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, his calloused palm a warm, solid presence against her own. Her gardening glove felt flimsy, insufficient against the sudden intimacy of his touch. "That contract is no longer enough for me. I don't want a duchess. I want a wife. I want a partner. I want to build a new life, here, with you and Rosalind." He paused, his gaze intense, searching hers for any sign of hesitation. "I have fallen in love with you, Ilara. I love your courage, your kindness, your quiet, unshakable spirit. You who society deemed plain have the most beautiful soul I have ever known." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, blurring the sight of his earnest, hopeful face. She had spent a lifetime feeling invisible, and now here was this man, this formidable, broken man, seeing her more clearly than anyone ever had. She had come to Blackwood prepared to be a servant, a functionary, a vessel, and in the process of healing his home, she had, without realizing it, healed him. And in doing so, she had found a love she never dreamed was possible. "Oh, Alistair," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I believe I have been falling in love with you since the day you sent me those gardening tools." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features into something breathtakingly handsome. It was the first true smile she had ever seen from him, and it was like watching the sun break through the clouds after a long, hard winter. He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was nothing like their first desperate, grieving encounter. This kiss was gentle, sure, and full of promise. It was a kiss of new beginnings, of spring after winter, of a love that had taken root in the most barren of soils and had, against all odds, blossomed. The year that followed was one of quiet, joyful transformation. The sunlight that had broken through on the morning after the storm seemed to take up permanent residence at Blackwood Manor. Laughter, a sound the old stones had not heard in years, became a frequent melody in its halls, most often from Rosalind, who had blossomed from a silent, fearful wraith into a bright, inquisitive, and cheerful little girl. She was the living heart of the home, a constant, happy presence, flitting between her father's study and her mother's garden. The garden itself became a masterpiece, a testament to Ilara's patient care and Alistair's newfound engagement with life. It was a riot of colour and scent from spring through autumn, a shared sanctuary where the family spent countless hours. Alistair, much to the astonishment of the staff, could often be found with his sleeves rolled up, working alongside Ilara, his hands in the same soil, their conversation easy and familiar. He learned the names of the flowers, the difference between an annual and a perennial, and the simple, profound pleasure of watching something grow. Society, with its long memory and longer tongue, was abuzz with whispers about the change in the Winter Duke. When he and Ilara began to accept invitations, attending local functions, and even a few balls in London, the ton was shocked. The formidable, reclusive Duke of Blackwood was gone. In his place was a man who, while still possessed of a natural gravitas, smiled openly at his wife, his eyes following her across a room with an expression of open, unguarded adoration. And Ilara, the plain Lady Vance, the grey mouse, was now a duchess who radiated a serene and confident beauty that had nothing to do with fashionable gowns or elaborate coiffures. It was the inner light of being loved, cherished, and respected. Those who had once mocked her, like her cousin Beatrice, could only stare in envious disbelief. Ilara had not only captured the most unattainable duke in England, she had, by some miracle, thawed his frozen heart and brought him back into the light. She never lauded her position over them. She met their fawning advances with the same quiet dignity with which she had once endured their scorn, a grace that only elevated her further in the eyes of those who mattered. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year and a half after their wedding, Ilara and Alistair stood on the cliff path, the same path that had been the site of so much tragedy. The sea below was calm today, a gentle expanse of blue-green, and the air was brisk with the clean, salty tang of the coast. Alistair's arm was wrapped securely around her waist, holding her close. Ilara rested her head on his shoulder, her own hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach, where their child grew. "Are you happy, Ilara?" Alistair asked, his voice a low, contented murmur against her hair. She turned her face up to his, her stormy eyes clear and bright. "I have never known such happiness was possible," she confessed. "I came here expecting a prison, and I found everything." He looked out at the sea, his expression thoughtful. The ghost of his past no longer haunted this place for him. The memory of Isabel was still there, a sad, soft ache of what was, but it was no longer a crushing weight of guilt. It had found its proper place in the story of his life, a tragic chapter that had, improbably, led to this new, joyful one. "It was you," he said, turning back to meet her gaze. "You were the one who had everything, right from the start. You had a strength and a goodness that I was too blind with my own pain to see. You taught me that a home is not built of stone, but of love, that a heart is not a fortress to be guarded, but a garden to be tended." He leaned down and kissed her, a long, slow kiss full of the quiet certainty of their shared future. Below them, in the walled garden, they could hear Rosalind's delighted laughter as she chased a butterfly among the last of the autumn roses. The sound drifted up to them on the breeze, a perfect, joyful note in the symphony of their new life. The Winter Duke was a legend, a story of the past. The man who stood here now, with his beloved wife and the promise of a new child, was simply Alistair, a husband, a father, a man who had walked through the longest of winters and had, through the patient, persistent love of a good woman, finally found his way home to the sun. Dear listener, have you ever felt overlooked, judged by a cover that doesn't begin to tell the story of the person inside? In a world that so often prizes the loud, the dazzling, and the superficially beautiful, it's easy for a quiet spirit to feel invisible. We see it all around us, the pressure to present a perfect, polished version of ourselves, to fit into a mold that society deems worthy. And when we don't, the whispers can feel as sharp as any blade. Elara's story is a quiet but powerful reminder that true worth is not measured in the currency of fleeting admiration or social standing. It is not found in the perfect feature or the glittering gown. True beauty, the kind that endures and transforms, is forged in the heart. It's the strength you show when no one is watching, the compassion you offer when it's not required, the quiet integrity that guides your choices when you think you have none left to make. Like Elara's garden, so many of us encounter hearts that have been left to ruin. People closed off by grief, by bitterness, by the harsh winters of their own pasts. Our first instinct might be to turn away from that coldness, to protect ourselves from the thorns. But what if we chose, instead, to see the potential for life beneath the neglect? What if we offered a little patience, a little quiet care, not to change them, but simply to let the sun in? Alistair was a man imprisoned by his own guilt, a winter of his own making. He didn't need a fiery spirit to match his late wife. He needed the steady, gentle warmth of a spring rain to soften the frozen ground of his soul. Elara didn't change him with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. She changed him by simply being herself, consistent, compassionate, and courageous enough to plant seeds of hope in the most desolate of places. She saw the man, not the monster. She tended to the brokenness, not the title. So the next time you feel like the grey mouse in a room full of peacocks, remember Elara. Remember that your quiet strength has the power to move mountains, to calm storms, and to make gardens bloom in the most unexpected of hearts. Your value is not in how brightly you shine for the crowd, but in the warmth you bring to the one. Never underestimate the profound, world-altering power of a kind and resilient spirit. It is the light that thaws the winter, and it is more than enough. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of their own quiet strength. We'd love to hear your thoughts